So Jeff will be leaving at 5 because of his flight, so we have to be sharp. So I would like to welcome you all to this session on SDGs. So Jeff Sachs needs no introduction. So we all know him, and he is the advisor of the Secretary General of the UN on SDGs. And today he will be sharing his views about the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals. So I will not want to delay further because of time limitation, and I would like to invite Jeff to make his initial remarks. Please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really delighted to be again at the annual meeting of the Islamic Development Bank. And I understand this is a special meeting with President Ali retiring, and I would like to pay tribute first to the President. He's been a remarkable founder and leader of this great institution, and also a great friend of global development, and it's been my tremendous honor to work together with the President Ali, first on the Millennium Development Goals, and now with the Islamic Development Bank on the Sustainable Development Goals. And so I want to wish him well and also note what an enormous contribution he has made to the whole world in development. I'm very pleased to meet today with you to talk about the global objectives that have been adopted for the next 15 years, because I believe that the IDB has an enormous role to play together with your partner institutions, the other multilateral development banks, in achieving these new goals. And as the special advisor to the UN Secretary General on the Sustainable Development Goals, I feel it's a wonderful opportunity to share some ideas with you about the SDGs, what they mean, why they're important, and what we can do to achieve success. So it is right to say that as of the end of last year, we've entered a new diplomatic era. I think we can call it the era of sustainable development, because the 193 member states of the United Nations unanimously agreed at the end of 2015 to two major unanimous agreements, the first being the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which were adopted at the United Nations on September 25th. The second major achievement came a few weeks later, and that is the Paris Climate Agreement, which was reached on December 12, 2015, and is very much part of the same framework, because the Sustainable Development Goals include the control of climate change as a central objective. Both of these agreements took many, many years to bring to fruition. The idea of having Sustainable Development Goals was first adopted in the year 2012, and the governments of the General Assembly then spent 3 full years negotiating the SDGs. The Paris Climate Agreement took even more time, because the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was first negotiated in 1992, and it was more than 20 years, therefore, until we reached a global agreement on how properly to implement that climate agreement. That shows how difficult the politics are around controlling climate change. And that's for many obvious reasons. And yet the dangers of climate change are very, very serious. And we have lost a lot of time in addressing this crisis. Oops. So, what is sustainable development? The essence of sustainable development is summarized by the holistic approach to development that embraces economic, social, and environmental objectives. So the right summary of sustainable development is economic progress that is socially inclusive and environmentally sustainable. And this is a key concept, in my opinion, because most of the effort globally in your member states and in the world has been devoted to the first objective of sustainable development, economic progress. And most of the time we are measuring economic progress by the per capita national income. But sustainable development is really telling us a very basic message, which is that we need to pursue objectives that are more holistic and more socially just as well. And in particular, sustainable development puts a strong focus on social inclusion and, of course, on managing the environmental threats. Now, in the course of the 3 years of negotiations, the governments considered several hundred proposed goals, and in the end, they arrived at 17 SDGs, or 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And these goals will be our agreed objectives globally for the period 2016 until 2030. And I want to emphasize these will be the only globally agreed development objectives for our generation, because it took a long time to negotiate them. It was very hard work to agree to them, and I don't believe that this process will be revisited until the year 2030. And so for the IDB and for all of our national governments and institutions, these goals will be the focus of global cooperation and attention. And it's our responsibility to make them work, to take them seriously, to put them into account. Today in the morning, I spent the very exciting session at the planning ministry of the Indonesian government at Bappenas. And the government of Indonesia is incorporating these sustainable development goals directly into the government's 11th plan. And I met with the Vice President Kula this morning, and he emphasized how these goals would become the center of the Indonesian government's development focus. That experience, I think, will be repeated all over the world, that every government will move now to integrate this basic globally agreed strategy into the national plans. And many, many cities around the world, hundreds of cities, have already signed on to the Sustainable Development Goals to incorporate them at the urban or metropolitan level as well. And across Africa, we are working on village-level sustainable development goals to take the same framework and apply it to rural development in even the district level or the commune level across Africa. Now, what are these challenges? As I said, broadly speaking, there are three big challenges: economic progress, social inclusion, and environmental sustainability. If we unpack them a little bit, I can list the following that are, I think, the central themes of sustainable development. First is ending extreme poverty. You know, the Millennium Development Goals, which this bank played a very important role in, aimed to cut the rate of extreme poverty by half between 1990 and 2015. The Sustainable Development Goals, number one, SDG number one, aims to end extreme poverty by 2030. This is a very, very big challenge for many of the member states of this institution. But I think that it is an achievable goal requiring a tremendous increase of focus and effort, but one that is worth undertaking. A second major goal on the environment is also a big challenge for many of the member states of this bank, and that is changing the energy system for environmental safety. I'll return to that in a few minutes. Another set of goals involves agriculture. Of course, the food system is at the center of our survival and at the center of many economies. SDG 2 calls for sustainable agriculture. That means agriculture that is productive for the farmers, that is nutritious for the diets of people around the world, that is sufficient to end hunger, and in which agriculture does not damage the environment. But as we know, we're not anywhere close right now to achieving sustainable agriculture because there is still massive hunger in the world, because diets are not well balanced, and because agriculture itself is a major force in environmental change, for example, water depletion, and because agriculture is very, very vulnerable to climate change. And so the goal of simply food security, which is a central objective, is a major challenge. Of course, one of the big topics for this bank, it was the topic of the previous session, is infrastructure. And SDG number 9 emphasizes the importance of sustainable infrastructure for roads, for power, for connectivity, and that is a central goal. Also, sustainable industrialization, so that industry is both environmentally sustainable, and so the poorest countries of the world, many of which are member states of the Islamic Development Bank, achieve a breakthrough to industrialization. SDGs 3 and 4 are about human capital. SDG 3 calls for universal health coverage. Remember that in the Millennium Development Goals, 3 out of the 8 goals focused on health, and big progress was made in controlling several diseases, AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria among them. In the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 3 goes even further and says we need health systems that are providing universal access. And again, in Indonesia today, we discussed the fact that the government has moved to a universal health insurance system, but with a great many challenges, very difficult problems of budgeting, finance, and implementation. And this will be true of many countries around the world. SDG 8 is extremely important for all of our member states, and that is decent jobs for all. Because many of the countries are experiencing high rates of youth unemployment, And often this is because young people have not been enabled to obtain the skills that they need for quality jobs. And so skill development and high rates of youth employment is a major theme of the Sustainable Development Goals. And finally, one of the pillars of the Sustainable Development Goals, as I mentioned, is social inclusion. This is a challenge in every part of the world, rich and poor alike. Income inequalities have widened. Discrimination against minority groups is a very serious challenge. The crises of migration that have been in the headlines day after day in recent months because of the Syria crisis are also cases of social exclusion. Gender inequality and lack of rights for girls and women, a very serious challenge addressed by SDG 5. Indeed, these sets of crises are so severe that just 2 weeks from now, actually less than 2 weeks from now, the World Humanitarian Summit will meet in Istanbul to take up these challenges. So this is a full agenda. It is a complex agenda. It is not an agenda for poor countries, it's an agenda for every country. And I know my own country, the United States, falls very far short of many of these goals. And so this is a framework that absolutely needs to engage every part of the world. Of course, we have some good news. This is not just utopian thinking or hopeless optimism. The Millennium Development Goals achieved a lot of progress. And a lot of the countries represented in this bank achieved tremendous progress in reducing poverty rates during the period of the MDGs. At a world level that's shown by the red line here, the World Bank calculates that extreme poverty declined from 37% of the world's population in 1990 to 9.6%, from 37% to 9.6% in 2015. This is very heartening news. And in Africa, the poverty rate declined from about 58% in extreme poverty down to 37%, according to the World Bank's estimate, in 2015. The goal of SDG 1, as I emphasized, is that these trends should continue all the way to zero by 2030. For many countries, this is readily within reach. Indonesia should absolutely be able to end extreme poverty, for example. For the poorest countries in Africa, this is a huge challenge, but it's one worth taking to accelerate the reduction of poverty. The trend is in the right direction, but more needs to be done. One of the facts that we know that's illustrated in this graph is that the key for this is the quality of education. And what is shown here is a relationship on the horizontal axis of the quality of education related to the rate of economic growth on the vertical axis. And countries that are high performing in educational attainment are the countries by and large that are growing rapidly and reducing poverty fastest. And so an emphasis on quality of learning, on completion of secondary education, on gender equality in school attendance and completion are all central also to the goal of ending extreme poverty. Now, there has been good news, but there's also some very difficult news, which is why these goals were adopted. I would say there are 4 big unmet challenges. First, there is still nearly 1 billion people in extreme poverty, and many of them are member states of the Islamic Development Bank. And it is our highest responsibility to help those countries escape from the trap of extreme poverty. The second unmet challenge, as I mentioned, especially, for example, in my own country, is rising inequality. So even countries that have made rapid economic progress have often experienced significant increases of inequality of income and social tension that surrounds those rising gaps of wealth and income. The third major factor is unprecedented environmental risks, especially from human-made climate change and the destruction of ecosystems. And the fourth big challenge is we're too good at war and we're not good enough at solidarity. And so we're spending a tremendous amount of time and lives in conflict when we should be attending to the urgent challenges of development. These are really, in my view, the most important of the unmet challenges of sustainable development. Now, let me turn to a couple of these issues in a little bit more detail, if I might. Trying to go back one slide. There we go. I think we all appreciate that the reason that the Climate Change Treaty was adopted last December and the reason that SDG 13 calls on all countries to fight human-induced climate change is that we have already arrived at a very significant, deep climate crisis. And this map is the map produced by the U.S. government, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, showing the excessive warm temperatures around the world in the year 2015. It's a map of the so-called temperature anomalies. Wherever it's red, it means hotter than average, hotter than the average of 1951 to 1980 during last year. And what you see is, of course, the entire planet is red, with only very, very few exceptions out in the oceans. Last year was the hottest year in the entire record of instrument measurements of Earth's temperature, which goes back to 1880. Last year broke every record by far. And this year, every single month of 2016 so far has broken the record for that individual month. And April was the warmest month ever of any month compared to its previous history. So we are already deeply on the path of global warming, and the threats are extremely high. And one of the big threats that I think is worth emphasizing is the threat from global warming that we're going to have a rise of ocean levels so high that the results could be absolutely catastrophic for an island economy like Indonesia or for a low-lying country like Bangladesh, which essentially would disappear under the rising water level. This is a map that was made by NASA in the United States, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, that shows what would happen if the ocean level were to rise by 6 meters. Why 6 meters? Because the last time that Earth was 2 degrees Celsius warmer than the pre-industrial level, in geologic history, the sea level was 6 meters higher than it is today. And what the scientists are telling us is that we are on a trajectory, if we do not stop climate change, to cause a catastrophic rise of the sea level. I would ask you to take a look at the map and look at where you live. If it's in red, it means your house will be underwater if the ocean rises 6 meters, including, of course, the Jakarta Convention Center, including my home in a small island economy called Manhattan, all underwater. This is the kind of danger that we are courting, a kind of disaster. And that's why the Sustainable Development Goals have moved beyond the challenge of poverty, which is so important, to the challenge of environmental sustainability as well. Because we're just on the border of environmental catastrophe. Now, what should be done about this? How could a goal like stopping human-made climate change actually be achieved? Oh, yes, I wanted to show you that curve. The answer is you have to plan for a new kind of energy system. And this is not easy. This is a graph that shows 4 different scenarios for the future emission of carbon dioxide from the use of oil, gas, and coal. The top 2 lines show what the business as usual trajectory for the 21st century would lead to. And the estimate by the scientists is that we would have warming of 4 to 6 degrees Celsius if we continue business as usual. The only way to stay with climate safety would be to achieve the lowest level, the blue line, which is a path of carbon dioxide emissions that goes down and down and down and reaches the level of 0 in 2070. What does that mean, to have 0 carbon emissions? It means that we have changed the energy system from one that's based on coal, oil, and gas to one that's based on solar energy, wind energy, nuclear energy, hydroelectric power, or other forms of low or 0 carbon energy. This is a very difficult and big challenge. And it's notable that the largest member state of this bank, Saudi Arabia, has recently declared, just 3 weeks ago, that it is intending to move, as was declared, off the addiction of oil to a diversified economy. This is a smart and necessary policy, a very smart one, because in the course of the next 50 years, the world has to move to a new energy system. And that means that countries that are today heavily dependent on fossil fuels, that's most countries, and your member states that are heavily dependent on the export of fossil fuels, are going to face a tremendous economic challenge of diversifying their own energy systems, as well as diversifying their economies so that the economy doesn't depend on the export of coal, oil, and gas in a world in which the use of coal, oil, and gas is going to decline dramatically. It will have to decline dramatically, and there will be a massive shift towards renewable energy. What's interesting for the member states of the Islamic Development Bank is that many of them are major oil producers. Indonesia is a major coal producer. It's the 4th largest coal exporter in the world. But your countries also have huge reserves of renewable energy as well. Saudi Arabia can not only supply all the oil the world needs, but it could supply all of the solar energy the world needs as well. And so the potential to deploy solar energy throughout the Gulf region, of course, or North Africa, Or in the case of Indonesia, there's massive geothermal energy potential, as well as solar energy potential, as well as ocean current potential. Has to be one of the major themes of how to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So let me conclude by just saying some of the major ways that I think the bank and your partners, and I look forward to being a partner with this great institution in the years ahead in my capacity at the United Nations, need to work together to achieve these major goals. The first point I would stress is we have to plan for success. These goals will not achieve themselves. There is no magic of the marketplace that will make the private sector achieve a fair, sustainable, socially inclusive economy. This has to be the work of government and the private sector, and for both government and private sector, long-term planning will be essential. That's why an institution like Bappenas, the National Planning Agency of Indonesia, is so essential. And I'm trying to convince my own government, the United States, to have a Department of Planning. You know, we don't believe in planning in the United States. We think that the markets just will make enough magic to solve the problems. But if you look at the direction that the U.S. drives now, it's a little bit like drunk driving. We don't know exactly where it's going. We need some planning and we need some long-term direction. And that's why I would really emphasize for every government the importance of long-term thinking. The Sustainable Development Goals call on you to have a 15-year perspective. A 5-year plan is not enough. These goals require at least 15 years to achieve. And when you think about a goal like energy diversification or decarbonizing the energy system, that's going to require 40 years, not just even 15 years. And so this requires a lot of forward planning. And that's the first point that I would emphasize. Second, of course, the key to success will be increased investments in high priority sectors. And that's where the Islamic Development Bank becomes so important. I hope that you can scale up your lending because your member states need increased investments, and the multilateral development banks, in my opinion, have a huge role to play in this scaled up investment because these are not primarily private sector investments, but public investments or partnership investments. And that's where development financing becomes so important. What are the areas that are needed? Obviously, increased investment in infrastructure, increased investment in human capital, especially health and education, increased investments in research and development, what could be called knowledge capital or innovation capital, increased protection of the natural environment or of natural capital, and also, of course, two other forms of capital, social capital, which means investing in trust and goodwill in society, and finally, business capital, what the private sector needs to bring on its own profit-oriented plans and projects. But for all of these, the role of the multilateral development banks will be central. Third, we're going to need a lot of global networking and brainstorming. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon asked me several years ago to help set up a global knowledge network to engage universities around the world and scientists around the world on how to achieve these goals. And I want to make sure that the Islamic Development Bank is both a strong member of this network and also, I hope, a user of this network, that the information, the strategies, the scientific knowledge can be brought to bear effectively. Here are some of the member universities and national networks of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. And incidentally, in Kuala Lumpur yesterday, we opened an SDG Center of Excellence for the ASEAN region. And in Bali, we will have a headquarters for the SDSN network of Southeast Asia. And so we'll have a lot of presence and representation in this region with the intention to work together with universities and businesses and the IDB, UN agencies and governments to help promote an accelerated progress towards the SDGs. A fourth point that I think is obvious is that our most powerful new tools are information technology. I see everyone with their smartphones taking pictures, maybe some people tweeting. Our social networks and our ability to use information technology to spread news, to spread ideas, is fundamentally important for us. Countries that are well connected with broadband will go much further than countries that lack access to broadband. And I would regard this as a core public sector strategy for any country to ensure that within the next few years, every school, every clinic, every hospital, every university, every government department is online and has good connectivity so that each of these facilities can be providing state-of-the-art services and be connected to the internet and connected to the networks of service providers and service users. I believe that e-governance will be one of the most important ways to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Soon enough, I believe that everybody will have their online identification, their online bank accounts, their online payments, their smart city apps like we've seen for Jakarta, where you go to Smart Jakarta and you can get information about the city, make complaints, write reports, get feedback. And I believe that these smart applications are critical for health delivery, for the quality of education, for financial inclusion, for monitoring the environment, for smart infrastructure, for energy efficiency. So if your broadband networks are not well developed, make the point to build out those networks. And the private sector will invest a lot of the funds necessary for that, but the government should be one of the major users for the health sector, the education sector, the infrastructure sector. This will be a key way to accelerate progress. Of course, good governance and public participation will be central. At least in my country, the politicians won't care hardly at all unless the public cares, because our politicians are followers, so they follow the public mood. And we need public participation. And what's very exciting for me is young people all over the world are getting engaged and getting interested and pressing for sustainable development as a real achievement. And this, I think, is critical for good results. Integrating the business sector is extremely important as well, because while the public sector is critical for health and education, while the public sector is uniquely critical for infrastructure, it's the private sector that will provide the preponderance of jobs, technology in the economy. And the public and the private sectors are complementary with each other. Without good public investment, there won't be good private investment. But if there is good public investment in health and in skills and in infrastructure, the private investment will be critical. And all over the world, businesses are asking, what can we do? How do we fit into the Sustainable Development Goals? And I would urge every government to be in active discussion with your business community around the role and responsibility of business towards sustainable development. Sometimes it's very positive in the sense that business can provide new approaches and new technologies, like in information technology. Sometimes it's negative in the sense that the businesses have to stop what they're doing, like deforestation, or they have to shift from fossil fuel energy to renewable energy. And so there's a big responsibility of business to become more sustainable. But engaging the business leadership is therefore key. And finally, I want to say that in order to achieve these goals, we need a shared ethical framework. And this, in my view, is essential. The world thinks it's divided, but average people share values all over the world that are the same values. They want a good, peaceful environment for their children. They want opportunities for their children. They want it to be treated fairly, and they will treat other people fairly. We have the basis for global ethical agreements, and I think that it is the common values that are so important. And those values, I know, are strongly represented at this institution. And making clear that sustainable development is not simply a technical list of things to check off or a technical plan, but is basically fulfilling the common ethical objectives of people all over the world is of fundamental significance. Let me thank you again very much for the role that this bank plays in fighting poverty and in promoting sustainable development. Let me thank you for the honor that you've given me to speak to you today, and let me thank you in advance for the years ahead of good partnership on achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you very much.
Okay, good. So, given the time limitation, I will skip my questions. I will directly move to our colleagues in the audience. So, please raise your hands for your questions to Jeffrey Sachs. So, we have one brother here. We can start with you. I think there are microphones. Yes. And let's have a second question from the back. And then we will finish with Dr. Rami in the first round. We can get 3 questions. Okay, please. Can you kindly introduce briefly, very briefly, yourself? Yes.
Thank you. I'm Aries from the Ministry of Finance Indonesia. Professor Sachs, it's good to see you again from the Human Ecology class back in the MTADP program in New York. My question is, considering like the recent economic slowdown, as well as especially for the ADB member countries, not only they facing the issue within their own countries, but also the refugee influx to their countries, like the Turkey and Jordan. How do you think that pursuing the SDGs should work in those countries? And the second one is as you previously mentioned during the MDGs implementation, you led the Millennium Village project mainly in Africa as well as in Asia, in like Cambodia. For the SDGs, do you conduct new ideas, and as well as the implementation for the not only developing but also developed country, as the SDGs tied not only to developing but also developed countries? Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we can have the lights on, and please, Dr. Rami and brother in the behind. Yeah.
Professor Sachs, thank you very much. Thank you for everything and all your online courses and all the thoughts on development. I have two questions for you. I was wondering if your previous thoughts on sustainable villages has been updated, shifted, or retracted given the actual results and the effectiveness of the previous initiatives. And my second question is, in terms of post-conflict situations, where does the SDGs really fare out? Take example Syria, for example. For the next few years, the question of reconstruction, if a peaceful settlement is reached, how would countries coming out of conflicts like this would need to readjust in terms of the SDG goals? Thank you.
Thank you. So we have last question for this round. Yes, brother.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Muhammad Bara Ampera. I'm from Fiscal Policy Agency of the Ministry of Finance. And my question is probably only a simple question. So what do you think is the most important economic instruments or fiscal instruments that countries like us need to ensure that the sustainable development takes place? Thank you. Assalamualaikum.
Great.
Back to you, Professor Sachs.
Thank you. Excellent questions, as I would expect. I think the key to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals is to increase the pace of investment. Because really, if countries have a high rate of investment that is well balanced across infrastructure, human capital investment, natural capital investment, and business investment, you get good growth that is balanced and fair. And to my mind, our economic slowdown right now is a result of saving that is not being put to good use. And in fact, the US philosophy is often try to boost consumption, but that's a very short-term approach in my mind. We should be boosting investment because the world has a lot of uses for investment that are extremely important. Building infrastructure, educating our children, providing health care, protecting the environment. So if there is excess saving in the world economy, I would like to deploy it by increased public investment. And I do believe that I believe that the Islamic Development Bank and other multilateral development banks should raise their own level of intermediation and then provide long-term financing to member states for increased public investment spending. This is not so much for Keynesian stimulus as it is for long-term development. But I think that any country that doesn't have full access of its children to education, or any country that does not have full access to electricity right now, or does not have a proper infrastructure network, should be borrowing to complete investments in those areas. And so I really do think that this is the main policy instrument that should be upgraded. Of course, to the extent that those investments can be financed out of better use of domestic tax revenues, that's important. To the extent that companies that are operating in your countries are not paying their fair share for royalties, for example, collect your taxes and then use them for increased public investment. But if you have developed your domestic financing and you still have increased investments to undertake, that's where I think the external financing is very, very important, and I would not hesitate to use it, because there's nothing that's going to be more dangerous in the world than having a whole population of children without a proper education, who become young people without skills. What are they going to do for the rest of their lives? We can't go on the way we've gone on, where only 20 or 30% of kids in some places finish secondary school. We have to use the Sustainable Development Goals to say, now we really scale up education. Now we really scale up access to electricity. Now we really scale up infrastructure, because without that, you're trapped. You're really trapped in a low-level economic trap. And so I would advise more borrowing and more public spending. Of course, it's got to be well done and well used, but it's the reason why I believe that the multilateral development banks have such an important role to play. I don't agree with my colleagues in the economics profession that say we have a new era of secular stagnation, they call it. In other words, we're doomed to slow growth. I don't believe that at all. We could have very rapid growth. And the reason China has had very rapid growth over the last 30 years is that it saved a lot and invested a lot, and invested well. And the reason the United States has very low growth right now, by the way, is that we save only a little bit and we invest only a little bit. And so our saving rate minus our depreciation of capital is basically zero now. It's not surprising the US economy doesn't grow very fast. But our Congress, for example, is more interested in giving tax cuts than it is in making public investment. This is a big mistake, because we should be collecting more in taxes and then using those taxes to invest in modernizing our infrastructure. But too many people, powerful people, want their taxes cut. They don't want to pay taxes for infrastructure or for quality education of the children. But I think for your countries, it's extremely important to increase the investment rate, and also to work to increase the rate of government revenue collection and the rate of national saving. I was asked about the Millennium Village Project and its counterpart of the bank, the Sustainable Village Project. I think we have found that community-based development is very important, especially in rural areas, because communities are a natural scale for investment. What we learned in the Millennium Village Project is that it's possible to have effective, low-cost health systems if they are consciously deployed at the village level. We've seen a tremendous amount of progress. We've also seen a lot of progress in helping smallholder, poor farmers get access to machinery, to better seeds, to fertilizer, to the inputs that they need to become more productive farmers. That's extremely important. We've also learned how to deploy microgrids for solar-based power systems. So for communities that are outside of the electricity grid, you can still have modern electricity services to support small businesses. Of course, what we also learned is that operating only at the village level is not enough, because this has to be combined with urban-based development and national-scale infrastructure. But we are continuing with the Millennium Village concept, but as with you, and you took the lead, these are now not Millennium Villages, but sustainable villages, because we're now in the SDG era. And I look forward to continuing to work together with the bank on this very important project of rural development, because I think the positive lessons are extremely important. Let me say a word about the conflict situations. There is one very, very effective way to achieve development in conflict zones. It works extremely well, and that is stop the conflicts. We have to stop the Syrian war. This is unfortunately a proxy war. It's not really a war about Syria. It's a war about regional competition in the Middle East. And I believe that we need to stop the war because it's not going to solve any problems. By the way, today, actually, perhaps literally today, but this week is the 100th anniversary of one of the worst policies ever made. 100 years ago this week, Mr. Sykes and Mr. Picot signed a secret agreement between the British Empire and the French Empire, the Sykes-Picot Treaty. And what they did was to decide how they were going to secretly divide up the Ottoman Empire. And they created 100 years of difficulty. They drew the boundaries of Syria so that France could have Syria and Britain could have Iraq, and so on and so forth. And that kind of outside intervention still helps to understand how it is that we have the conflicts that we have today. And the United States got engaged in these conflicts as the new imperial power after 1945. And my view is 100th anniversary is a very good time to say enough. So I have dreamt that the 100th anniversary of the Sykes-Picot Treaty would also be the end of the Syrian conflict. Now I know I'm a little bit dreaming of this, but we have a ceasefire agreement in the UN Security Council, and I think if all of the major powers of the region, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iran, together say we are going to live together peacefully, and I keep saying you've lived together for 2,000 years, you know how to make it work. And if the big countries like my own or Russia or others would say, we don't get involved, but the local powers work out peacefully the solution, this war could end. And I really emphasize this. I'm sorry to be so political, but I was asked, we cannot solve sustainable development if the conflicts continue. The wars are the biggest enemy of development of any kind. And we shouldn't be knocking down infrastructure only to spend billions of dollars to build it back again. That makes no sense at all. We don't have that kind of luxury in this world that we can knock down things and then spend our time rebuilding what we just knocked down. So please, let's stop the wars, and then I'm sure in a peaceful environment, Syria could have a rapid rebound because it was a fully functioning middle-income country making progress on development up until March 2011. And you could look at the human development indicators for Syria. They were improving over time. And it was only the war that caused this catastrophe. And so I think we have to make a much harder attempt to stop the wars.
Thank you, Jeff. I know we have a flight at evening, but let's have one round, last round of questions from the floor. So we have one question here. Do we have any sisters? Yes, one question there. And last question. Let's have two, we have two hands. Mm-hmm. Let's have one from here and one from here. 4 questions for
Okay.
you. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much for this good presentation. I have 2 questions. The first question regarding the financial inclusion, and the second question about the early childhood development. You remember, Professor Jeffrey, when we started the Millennium Development Goal, nobody was believed that microfinance is a strong tool to alleviate poverty. It took us almost 25 years to convince central banks and government that microfinance should be part of the financial system. Nowadays, we are heading to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal, while most of the central banks right now in the developing country is not welcoming the financial inclusion, and they thought that financial inclusion just giving a loan on open account, while it's open account, micro saving, micro insurance, education loan, etc. What is your advice to the developing country, while right now the existing financial system is making things difficult after Basel III, while what is your advice to include those people through financial inclusion? My second question, I like when you said if you want to achieve it, we have to have a quality of education. Why 90% of our children have no access to preschool education? So how can we have our next generation to be smart, creative, innovative, while all this could be developed before 6 years old? So what is your advice? Because we now looking at 90% of our children have no access to preschool education.
Thank you.
Please, if you could elaborate on this issue, how that will help us in development. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Please, next, please. Yes. We can have only one question because of time limitation.
Yes, please. Professor Geoffrey Sachs, that's a very, very big pleasure to meet you. I come from Uganda. You're such an inspiration on development.
Yes.
I had two questions, but you've kind of touched the next one. I work for government. Sustainable development goals will require a lot of nurturing. And you very well know IDB works through the government structure, which I don't want to negate, but at the same time, it cannot afford the intricacies of nurturing a very new and novel global agenda like the SDGs. So what cautions and what tips are you giving to the governments present here? Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Jafar Badawab from Sustainable Village Project in Sudan. My question is that we are working the MDG or goals, and now we are speaking about SDG. Can you give us a hint why you are jumping from this to that, or we are working on the same phenomenon? Thanks.
Can you repeat the question,
Sorry,
please?
just
Yeah,
a
the
little bit
question is
louder.
that we are working on the MDG goals, and now we are speaking about sustainable or SDG goals. Why you are jumping from this to that, or we are going to the same, or the measurements are the same? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And last question, please. Can you have that microphone, please?
Thank you very much, Professor Sachs, for your insights. It would seem to me that one of the reasons why it took such a long time to approve the SDGs and why we have reached, as you say, the point of deep climate crisis is because there is an inherent time horizon mismatch between what is required to achieve SDGs, particularly through long-term investment projects in infrastructure, in education, in environmental remediation, and the time horizon that most of the governments operate under. One is 15 plus years, the other one is 4 to 5 years. What is the solution to this challenge? How do we overcome this inherent challenge in planning for long-term?
Thank you. Thank you very much. So in fact, Alex, can you kindly bring the microphone to Professor Kabir Hassan? He is the winner of our Islamic Finance Award this year, so we should give him an exception to ask the last question. He's
Right
here.
in the front row.
In the front, please.
Well, just one simple question, Professor. SDG, in order to achieve these goals, we need financing. Of course, the conventional space with all its problems cannot really, and in many cases, many people say that they're also the cause of this inequality, many things. I mean, I do not know how much you are versed in Islamic finance, but I hope you will also engage yourself in Islamic finance in order to find a solution for these SDG goals. That will be my
Great.
wish.
Thank you.
Thank you. Back to you,
Excellent.
Professor Sachs. Thank you.
Thank you for all these wonderful questions and comments. First, on financial inclusion, I think the beauty of what we can do now because of online banking and online identification is much greater than was true 20 or 30 years ago. When I first encountered Grameen Bank, for example, of course it was a women's lending circle in Bangladesh, and they met face to face, and this was a great pioneering achievement. But now we can do much more, actually, and it's very interesting because of innovations of e-payments, for example, or M-Pesa in the money wallet, e-wallet initiatives, or the unique identification systems that are being introduced in many countries, like India, which is biometrically, with an eye scan, given 1 billion unique identifications to the citizens. Now banks, conventional banks, but also telecoms and other companies are able to offer financial services of all kinds at much lower transactions costs. It could be microinsurance, it could be micro-lending, it could be micro-banking, it could be payments. And of course, as many of you know, Western Union used to charge maybe 10% for transferring remittances, and now that rate is going to come down to less than 1% because of simple e-payments systems. So we have a possibility of designing new, innovative financial inclusion instruments. And I would use information technology very actively to promote this. And if the banks are falling behind, let non-bank services take this up. But there are new ways to do this, and I think that financial inclusion will become a normal part of having a mobile smartphone for anybody, and I believe that it will make an important difference. On the question of education, of course, this is a major challenge. And what we know about education is it's hard work of everybody, and it starts at birth or even before birth with a healthy pregnancy. But very young children need good nutrition, good health care, good intellectual stimulus. Children before the normal school age need early childhood development, and that's one of the goals of the Sustainable Development Goals in SDG 3, that every government should offer pre-kindergarten education. And this, I think, can make an important difference. But then we have to help keep our kids in school. And the SDG 4 calls for every child to be able to complete a secondary education. Think of what that means in many of the member countries right now, where only 20 or 30% finish secondary school. It means we have to really scale up education services. Now, again, I don't think that there is any magic formula to do this, but I think information technology can play an important role. Because if you have broadband, you can use it for teacher training, you can use it for online curriculum, you can use it for e-mentoring, where young students are given help not by someone sitting next to them, but by someone facing them on a screen even. And my own course, I am very appreciative that my university lecture course is online for free. Anybody can go online and take the class Age of Sustainable Development for free. And I've had about 100,000 students take the class since it went online. And that, I think, we should make available worldwide. And I have a project in the UN to develop a full curriculum of sustainable development, and this is going to be freely available for anybody in the world. And so that's another way that we should use information technology. We have to help our kids get the skills that they need. This is so absolutely essential for success. On the question of, very good question, of how governments can take on this complicated agenda, I have to say this is a complicated agenda. It's not a simple agenda. And we do need new approaches. I think for the planning ministry in Indonesia, for Bappenas, which is taking on the Sustainable Development Goals, this is a big challenge and a big opportunity. And as I said, in my own country, we don't even have a planning ministry to take this on, and I think that that's very unfortunate. We are trying in our program for the UN, in my work for Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, to help governments get the support they need for the new tools to achieve the SDGs. And we've also recently opened up, actually this past week, in Kigali, an SDG Center of Excellence that will be available for the entire region. It's chaired by President Kagame. It has 5 other African presidents on the board. It will be available to Uganda. Anybody can just contact me directly, by the way, and I can help make the contact. My email address is very easy. It's just my name, Sachs, S-A-C-H-S, at Columbia, the university, COLUMBIA.edu. So Sachs@columbia.edu. I can't tell you how hard I had to negotiate for such a simple email address, but they gave it to me. I said, I don't want any numbers, underscores, periods, nothing. I just want my name and the university. So that's my email address. Feel free to write to me, and I will make the contacts for you so that you can get connected to the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. On the question of the time horizon, when I was young, the United States had 2 big projects that I very distinctly remember. One was our interstate highway system, and this was announced by President Eisenhower. It was continued by President Kennedy, it was continued by President Johnson, and it was completed by President Nixon. So that was a 4-president project. And then we had the space shot, the mission to the moon, and that was announced by President Kennedy in April 1961. It was continued by President Johnson, and it was completed by President Nixon in the summer of 1969 when the moonshot was successfully completed. So here were 3 governments, or 4 presidents, different political parties, but they took on a national mission. This is very unusual in America now. We barely do anything that lasts any horizon. And every government stops the program of the government before it now. But then we're not going to the moon, you know. It becomes a big reduction of what's achieved. We can't even get our highways repaired, much less build them anymore. And so we have to take these big projects beyond government, beyond politics. These have to be national projects so that one government starts it and the next one continues it and the next one continues it. And it's not a matter of short-term politics, but national mission. And I do believe that this should be the national mission of every country. The national mission should be end poverty. The national mission should be a modern, renewable energy-based energy system, and so on. And a national mission should be quality education for children. How can that be a claim of one political party and not another political party? That should be for everybody. So I think that the biggest success stories come when this is outside of normal politics. I don't dispute normal politics. One politician will say, I'll do a better job than the next one. And that kind of competition is fine, but not competition over whether you want children educated, over whether we want child care to stop, over whether there should be universal access to health services. That should be national goals beyond any political party. And then let them argue who can do a better job, but let's have a national project that goes on for 15 years or a generation or more. And finally, on Islamic finance for the Sustainable Development Goals, this is a wonderful contribution that I would like this bank and you, Professor, to make big recommendations on. Because one of the problems that is very real is I believe there needs to be a lot more financing for investment. But that in Western finance would mean a lot more debt. But in Islamic finance, it might not be debt. It may be sukuk or more manageable kinds of financing that don't lead to the same financial crisis. So maybe Islamic finance can provide the key to say, yes, it's possible to have a lot more financing, but that doesn't build up unpayable debt. It involves sharing the equity, in essence, in these long-term projects. So if the bank could come forward with proposals, not only for your members, but for the international financial system as well. Because the last financial crisis was a Wall Street crisis. It was not an Islamic finance crisis. It was a crisis of too much debt, too much borrowing, too much short-term financing. And so I would be absolutely thrilled to help champion innovative approaches based on the principles of Islamic financing, which could be a vehicle for a lot more investment getting undertaken without building up a huge balance sheet debt on the same side. And I think that's a very exciting idea that I hope we could explore together.
Thank you. Thank you. In fact, on this note, we can conclude this session, but just a final remark. Of course, Islamic Development Bank has invested a lot in the promotion of Islamic finance, not only in our member countries, but globally also. And we are very pleased that now the World Bank, the IMF, they are considering very seriously in moving forward with Islamic finance tools in supporting the countries in this ambitious global agenda. So tomorrow we will have another event on Sustainable Development Goals with the participation of some of our governors as well. So, and we would like to thank you for your active contribution on Sustainable Development Goals agenda. And we will be pleased to be working with you through SDSN and other opportunities. And I'd like to thank you all for staying late, and with your active questions, we had a lively session. Thank you very much, and let us give one big applause for Jeffrey Sachs.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we got a lot to talk about,
yes.
and we'll talk soon.
Yes.
Good.